So you worked quite closely with PMC when setting up?
Yeah, we did, and the guys, I mean, the guys come down after you've set the studio up and they do all their tests. You know, Andy came down with his frequency spectrum, malarkey, and fired all his signals and recorded it all, and basically told us that the room was pretty damn spot on acoustically. You know, I think we moved them about an inch that way and a centimetre forward, and that's about as much as they did, really. I mean, obviously we were fingers crossed when we switched them on, because you just don't know what they're going to sound like, you know. You've designed a room and you've had it built, but until you actually switch the things on, you've no idea how they're actually going to sound. Excuse me. And, you know, they sounded fantastic, so we were very chuffed. But we were standing there, you know.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
And so how do you choose a supplier like that? I mean, because you'd worked with PMC before?
Yeah, I mean, you know, having had them, we had the small ones at Nomis. We had the IB, is it the IB ones? I had at Nomis Studios in my room there, which were great. They're okay. And then obviously at the townhouse, we had the BB5s. And after working on those, you don't really want to go to anything else. I'm sure there are some great speakers out there, but it's what you're used to, and you know the sound of them, and you know how they're going to respond. So yeah, that was our reasoning to stick with what we knew, basically.
Fantastic. And what about the lathe that you've got here? It's a beauty. Where did that come from?
That's an old Whitfield Street lathe. When they shut Whitfield Street Studios down, they auctioned off all the gear, and we bought that from a guy that had bought it from the auction, basically. So there was actually another lathe in this building. There was, because when we took over, there was a company here called the Master Room before us, and they had a lathe as well. So, but before we got this building, we thought the lathe had come up for sale. We thought, let's just get it, you know, put it in storage, which we did for a few months, not knowing that we were definitely coming here. But it was there's so few of them about, basically, and it was a pretty good bargain that we got it for. So then when we did actually move here, we then had two lathes, so we decided to sell on the other one.
This being the superior of the two?
Well, it was more that we'd already set this one up, actually, in here. The other one was in another room, and it was the grief it is to dismantle them, to move it out. I mean, that took 6 of us to move that in here. They're damn heavy beasts. So it was more that once this one was set up, I think the other one actually might have been a little bit better mechanically. It was a little more tight. I mean, the sound was no different, but just the mechanical workings of it seems a little bit more sort of maintained and looked after. But like I said, once you've paid someone to set this one up, you're not then going to dismantle that one, move that one in, and then you've got to all that setup time again. So.
Okay, so that's the lathe. We've covered the monitoring without going through every single bit of kit here. But what are, for instance, like your go-to EQ at the top there?
Yeah, I mean, I use a bit of digital EQ and I use a bit of analog EQ. I use my digital EQ more for sort of tight notch filtering, you know, when you really need to get in. The analog EQs can't really go as tight a cue point as a digital EQ. I'm sure there are some that do, but the ones that we use don't. So I tend to use the TC6000 with the Massenburg EQ in it for a little bit of EQ to start with, just the odd frequency, the odd rogue frequency mainly. So it's more about pulling out a bit of notch filtering. And then I use mainly the Prism and the Manley and the Dolby Spectrum Dolby Spectral Processor. I'll say that again, the Dolby Spectral Processor for EQing. There's a nice Neumann EQ over there, which is part of the lathe setup, but that's sort of nice old analog EQ that we occasionally use. So like I said, mainly digital for tight control, and then analog for general warmth and general additive EQ rather than subtractive. Yeah.
Okay, and what about conversion? What do you guys?
We've got 2 converters. I mainly use the Prism Dream, and then we've got a Rosetta as well, an Apogee Rosetta, just in case you're working with a different sample rate. You can use the Prism Dream at different sample rates for its A to D and its D to A, but sometimes it's easier if you're working then from another playback system to use the Rosetta, or vice versa, basically. But mainly it's the Prism Dream, I have to say.
That's you as far as sounds concerned.
I think it's slightly better than the Rosetta. I think that most people would say that the Prism is just a tad more open and slightly better A to D, D to A. But it's good to have two in there for all sorts of situations, like I said, where you might be working with different sample rates.
Okay, and on the software side of things, you're running Sadie?
Yeah, Sadie 5 still. I think Sadie 6 is out, but we haven't switched to that yet. So, yeah, Sadie 5. Again, it's just what I learnt, there are other systems around, but as a 2-track editor, as a 2-track tool, I think it's fantastic, It's not like we're using it for multi-track recording or anything like that. So, the editing side on it is brilliant, very easy to use.
Cool. And so when you've got huge, beautiful, big main speakers like that, do you just switch back to the near fields just for a reference?
Yeah,
thing?
I do. I've got, what are
they?
they? I can't even remember what they're called. It's really bad, isn't it? They are the TB2s, aren't
yes,
they?
Yeah.
And they're cool. They're okay. They've, like I said to you earlier, they've got better as we've broke them in. When I first switched them on, I didn't like the sound at all. I found the top end very brittle. The bass end was a bit undefined. And I think when you're switching from the BB5s, you're always going to find that with a pair of little monitors. They do work a little bit like the NS10s, that they show up sort of humps around the 150 hertz area. They obviously have their plus points, and we do use them, but I have to say I'm 95% of the time I'm working with the BB5s.
Which, I mean, if you look at the price tags, it's
absolutely,
it's understandable.
Absolutely,
that's going to be considerably better. Well, you'd hope so.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. No, those big old PMCs are fantastic.
Okay, well, let's start with the very basics. What is mastering?
Yeah, okay. I mean, mastering originally stems from the fact that you are creating the master that the factory then press up from. So obviously in very olden days that was vinyl only, and then obviously in the sort of 70s cassette came along, and then in the 80s CD came along. So the essence of mastering is, whether it's a single or an album, you are putting together the elements of the single, the tracks for the single, the tracks for the album, and you are creating the master tape, basically.
And so when you get what you get from the mix engineer or whoever's last is just a stereo file.
Yeah,
correct?
stereo. Not always. We are doing a lot more these days of stems mastering, which is when you will get maybe sort of 5, maybe 4, 5, 6 stems. That usually occurs perhaps when the band aren't completely sure they're happy with the mix, so they'll bring you in, say, a drum stem, a bass stem, guitars, synths, vocals, etc. And then you've just got a bit more scope for control over those stems, basically. If you've only got a stereo mix and you go to EQ the vocals, then you've got to think you're going to be affecting other instruments in that frequency range, so i.e. the sort of mid to top end of guitars, snares, and then you think, okay, I want to manipulate the kick drum a bit. Well, then you've got to think, okay, am I ruining the bass sound or adding too much bass because I'm making the kick fatter, or vice versa? But as effectively, yeah, you usually, most of the time still, it is a stereo file, either on an audio CD or as a stereo WAV or an AV file or whatever.
So is that nice, having more control, or are you now having to do the mix?
You're mixing and mastering effectively. I mean, again, you're still limited because the stems have been bounced down with all the effects on that they had in the Logic or Pro Tools or whatever. The compression. You're still limited to a certain degree. But it just is. It's more that it gives you more control over the EQ. I think like I said, you want to EQ the vocals on their own. Your vocals might be really sibilant, so it enables you to go in and attack the sibilants without affecting things like hi-hats, which are in the same frequency range. But yes, effectively, it is sort of more mix mastering.
I mean, do you get frustrated? Do you do something and then people say, I want it louder, I want it louder? Do you get much of that?
You do, and you have to say there is a compromise between getting it louder and louder and then the fact that you're reducing the dynamic range more and more, and the first things you start to hear go are things like the snares, the kick drums, things that have got punch in them are the first thing that you lose, basically. So where you might have a nice punch in your kick and your snare, the louder you get it, the more you're going to lose that, basically. The more the waveform gets squashed into a tighter packed waveform, basically.
And do you think that some people are starting to understand this? Is there progress
There
in
is
this
a
field?
backlash against it. I think a lot of band, guys perhaps that are in more sort of, not acoustic bands, but more...
Not as heavy?
Not as heavy, not say the indie bands, the folky bands or the bluesy bands that want to retain the warmth and the dynamics of their recording are coming to us now and saying, look, I'm not fussed about it being the loudest CD out there. I just want to retain, as much character in the original recording as possible. The indie bands, the young indie bands, is a different issue, I suppose, because they are more the ones that want it hammered. They've been playing whatever CD that's been, recorded at some studio, mastered at wherever, and it's incredibly loud. They want their tracks to sit up with that. So you can understand their point of view. It's just a shame if you've got a nice recording to have to ruin it for the sake of a couple of dB, basically. Because there are fairly easy, simple ways of getting stuff to a reasonably loud level without compromising on the sound quality. But I think once you go past that, that's when you're into distortion territory, clipping, like I said, reducing the dynamic range of instruments. I could go on for hours about it, really, but...
No, it's good.
Yeah, it's something we've had to come to live with. We've had to do it. So it's something almost now that it's almost the first thing you discuss with the band, actually. Well, first off is, are you happy with your mixes? Have you got any issues? Have you been listening to it here, there? And what are your thoughts? And then the second thing you ask, or I tend to ask, is how loud do you want it? And usually I like the response of not hammered, basically, a reasonable level.